Alireza Firouzja has been trying to hide from us. He hasn't been playing in many recent tournaments, and he's not even going to be playing in Zay. He tried to hide, but we found him. Where? In the bowels of the internet chess world, the search function on chess.com. I found a game. It's a blitz game, 3 minutes with no increment, but it is between Alireza Firouzja and Hikaru Nakamura, very much the elite of chess and particularly fast time controls. Outside of Carlsen, they're really as good as anyone. And this game, Hikaru had the white pieces. Firouzja had black. Remember, it's 3 minutes for each side. Hikaru opened up with the move knight to f3. Firouzja plays knight to f6, and Hikaru plays b4. An unusual move, gaining space on the queen side, but leaving the pawns in the middle flexible for the moment. c6. Firouzja plays sort of a standard Slav idea. That Slavs work well against almost everything, really. It's a safe way to play. Bishop to b2, putting the bishop on the long diagonal. And Firouzja decides to immediately go after this b4 pawn, putting pressure on that to create a weakness. And Hikaru just decides to take it. Queen takes a5. And you can see already Firouzja, with his pieces on this half-open file, has decent development already. e3 to liberate the bishop at f1. d6, so the bishop at c8 can move. Also preparing the move e5 to get a percentage of the center. c4, e5, bishop e2, bishop e7, both sides castle. And then Hikaru plays d4, immediately gaining space in the center and putting the question to black. This position had only been reached once before, and in that game, black traded on d4. But in this game, Firouzja decides to play e4, gaining space in the middle of the board, hitting the f3 knight, and allowing his queen to shift over to the king's side. Knight to d2 and queen to g5. So Firouzja is setting up his formation to attack the king. He's already threatening to play bishop to h3, which would force g3 to prevent a mate, and then white would lose the exchange. Bishop takes f1. So king to h1 to move out of that pin that was on the g2 pawn. And now Firouzja plays d5, locking in that center. This gives him a fairly permanent space advantage, and now he can really go after the white king. He also locks in this bishop at b2, and the bishop can't play to a3 because the e7 and a8 rook control the square. So in order to get rid of that bad piece at b2, white plays a4. Now he can play bishop a3 and get rid of this lousy b2 bishop. Bishop to g4, looking to trade off probably white's best minor piece, this light squared bishop. Bishop to a3, the bishops are exchanged. Knight b to d7. And one of black's main attacking ideas is to play h5, h4 to attack these light squares on the king's side. White plays knight to c3. And here Firouzja plays rook f to b8 to add some defense to the b7 pawn. Probably h5 was a bit better here. It was certainly more aggressive. Rook f to b8, rook to b3, places his rook on the half-open file. And here Firouzja changes his mind. He decides to not exchange light squared bishops and brings the bishop back to e6. I guess he wants to keep the most pieces on the board as possible. And now Hikaru plays c5. I would think this would favor black, actually. Yes, white is gaining space on the queen side, but by locking up the center, it makes it easier for black to maneuver his pieces over to the king side for the attack. So knight to f8, he begins that maneuvering, and Hikaru, I think, realized at that moment that he can't just let black play knight g6, h5, h4, or he's going to get crushed. So Hikaru lashes out a bit with f4 to try to stop black from just getting his pieces comfortably into attacking positions. But here, Firouzja takes en passant. And now knight f3, and the problem with that is that the pawn on e3 is hanging. And Firouzja takes it, and he wins his first bit of material here with queen to e3. And here a5 is played. Now, it looks like this is a mistake, because white can play knight takes d5, unleashing the rook on the queen, grabbing the pawn at d5, and causing all kinds of trouble. But black can respond to this with knight takes d5, rook takes queen, and then after knight takes rook, he's still forking the rook and the queen. When the queen moves, he takes the rook. And in this position, black has two rooks for a queen, but he also has the better pawn structure, a weakness at d5. Black looks to be a bit better here. So white instead plays the move a5, and now queen to h6, but a much stronger move would have been knight to g4, threatening knight f2 check, which would win the exchange. If queen to c2, which would be a good response, knight f2 doesn't actually work here, because in this position, rook takes knight, queen takes knight, and then knight to d1 would trap the queen. So that would definitely not work in that position. Another move that doesn't work that well is rook takes a5. It looks like the pawn is just hanging, but the reason is when you play knight to d5 here, then knight d5, that same exact variation, then white plays queen to d2, counterattacking the rook at a5, and white is in very good shape there. So here black instead plays queen to h6. He's attacking the pawn at a5. He's got a pin on the pawn at h2. Queen to b1 attacks b7. Now rook takes a5 and exchanges on b7, and Hikaru's queen is very aggressively posted, directly attacking the pawn at c6, and Firouzja had a really, really good move here, a knight to h5. This threatens knight to g3 check, forking the king and the rook. The pawn can't take the knight because the queen pins the h2 pawn. If, say, king to g1, queen to e3 check, and that attacks the king and the knight at c3 when the king moves queen c3, and black would be winning. But instead, after queen takes b7, Firouzja plays rook to a3, attacking the knight on c3. The queen goes to b2, defending the knight, attacking the rook. The rook moves back. And now knight to e5. You see this c6 square is black's biggest weakness, this pawn on c6. So rook to c8 to defend it. But now bishop to a6. Hikaru attacks Firouzja's rook on c8. And you don't want to play a move like rook to c7. The rook really has nowhere to go, and it's very, very passive. So what Firouzja does is he plays rook to e8. Now that looks like he's just dropping an incredibly valuable pawn. But in this position, if knight takes c6, black gets a vicious attack after knight to g4, threatening mate on h2. Then when h3 is played, knight to e3, and this is a sample variation. There are other variations. But for example, if rook to f2, to save that rook, bishop takes h3, and black is all over white's king. If pawn takes, queen takes, blocking with the rook, queen g3, knight takes g2, queen g2, and then remember this knight on c3 is hanging in all these variations, and black is just completely winning. So instead, white plays the bishop back to e2, and that controls g4, keeps the knight from hopping into that square. Bishop to d7, now the pawn does need to be defended. Bishop to f3, and queen goes down to e3 to attack the d4 pawn. Another strong idea was knight to g6, immediately challenging this knight on e5. But queen to e3, threatening to take on d4, knight to a4. Now this defends the d4 pawn by the queen. It also threatens knight b6, then taking the bishop, and that leaves the c6 pawn hanging. So there are a lot of threats associated with this knight a4 move. But black goes straight ahead with knight to g6, knight takes bishop, and queen to b7. And to just look at it, it looks like Hikaru has a very, very strong position. He's attacking this pawn at c6 and the knight at d7. Well, how does black get out of it? He has a very, very powerful move. What move does Firouzja play to knock Hikaru out in this position? That's right, this move, queen to f2. It may look to some of you like he's just hanging his queen, but he is not. If rook takes queen, then rook to e1 check, and you get a back rank mate. If rook to b1, then rook to e1 check, and you still end up with a back rank mate. And if queen to a6, to keep the queen and the rook connected, then rook to e1 is still overpowering. So instead, Hikaru plays queen to b1 to keep this e1 square under control, but unfortunately for him, queen takes d4. He wins a valuable central pawn. He's still going to take this c5 pawn. The knight at a4 is stuck, and in this position, Hikaru Nakamura resigned. I hope you enjoyed the game. See you again soon. Bye.